Chapter 13: The Social Contract Tradition, the Theory and its Attractions. The Lure of Proceduralism. One of the hardest and deepest problems for ethical inquiry is this: how to begin. Should we assume from the outset that any plausible ethical theory will forbid rape and slavery and torture and require compassion and kindness? If so, then we can use these assumptions as a litmus test. Any theory that contradicts these assumptions would be rejected. For instance, if killing or torturing an innocent person were ever in your self-interest, then ethical egoism would require you to perform such actions. It would therefore flunk our test. That would be enough to show that ethical egoism is false. A question naturally arises: can we justify our basic assumptions and defend the practice of rejecting any moral theory that doesn't agree with them? If a theory contradicts our basic assumptions about right and wrong, why does that undermine the theory rather than our assumptions? Aren't we just begging the question against the ethical egoist, for instance, by assuming that self-interest could never justify torture or rape? Defenders of this approach claim that there is no other alternative. We have to start moral thinking from somewhere. Why not with those basic assumptions that almost everyone accepts, those that help support most of our other ethical claims? We can't prove that these assumptions are true, but that doesn't make them illegitimate. Why not? Because the fundamental starting point in every area of thinking are beyond proof. It turns out, for instance, that the basic assumption behind all scientific inquiry, that there is a physical world outside of our own mind, cannot be proven. All the evidence we might collect in order to prove it already assumes that such a world exists. Yet that doesn't render every scientific claim implausible or unjustified. Many philosophers remain dissatisfied with this approach. They believe that we can justify our basic moral views rather than simply take them for granted. We can do that by coming up with a procedure that will tell us the steps for distinguishing right from wrong. The correct moral views are those that emerge from the correct procedure. I call this sort of approach proceduralism. Proceduralism tells us that we should not begin moral inquiry by assuming, say, that slavery is wrong or that generosity is right. Make no moral assumptions at this stage. Instead, follow the correct procedure and then see what the outcome is. Provided you've been careful, you'll land on the right answer to your moral question. The Golden Rule is an instance of proceduralism. So is rule consequentialism. So is Kant's principle of universalizability. Each of these views tells us to follow certain steps in order to discover what is right and wrong. One of the main attractions of these views is that they do not take it for granted that slavery, for instance, is immoral. Rather, they promise to explain and justify why slavery is immoral. They do this by showing, respectively, that 1. We wouldn't like it if we were enslaved, 2. No optimific social rule would permit slavery, or 3. No universalizable maxim would allow slavery. If you've been reading these chapters in order, you know that there are significant problems with each of these proceduralist views. But that doesn't knock proceduralism out of contention, since there are many other proceduralist theories. Perhaps the most important of these is the social contract theory, nowadays known as contractarianism, the view that morality is based on a social contract. The background of the social contract theory. Contractarianism originated as a political theory and only later developed into a theory of morality. It tells us that laws are just if and only if they reflect the terms of a social contract that free, equal, and rational people would accept as the basis of a cooperative life together. Its view of morality stems directly from that political ideal. Actions are morally right just because they are permitted by rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by, on the condition that others obey these rules as well. The theory's political origins can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. Early in the Republic, Plato's brothers tell Socrates that they find the social contract view both appealing and troubling. They challenge Socrates to tell them what is wrong with it. His answer takes up almost the whole of the book, a testimony to the power of contractarianism. Here is the story that Socrates heard. We are all by nature largely or entirely self-interested. What we want is power over others, physical security, plenty of money, and sensual pleasure. Our deepest goal is to lord it over everyone else. Who among us wouldn't want the power of the president or the wealth of Bill Gates, or ideally both? This points to an obvious problem. Everyone wants to be at the top of the heap, and only a few can make it there. Further, no one wants to be a patsy, the person who gets stepped on as others climb the ladder of success. We each want to be number one, but we know that the chances of making it are slim, and we want to avoid being trampled as others claw their way to the top. So what do we do? If we are rational, we will each agree to curb our self-interest and cooperate with one another. We'll do this conditionally, that is, on the condition that others do so as well. A complete free-for-all is going to make everyone miserable. If we all stop trying to get the better of each other and instead agree to seek a little less for ourselves, then we'll all be better off. That is what reason and morality require of us, according to the social contract theory. Starting with the assumptions that we each are largely motivated by self-interest and that it is rational to be that way, contractarianism tells us that we each do best for ourselves by agreeing to limit the direct pursuit of self-interest and accept a bargain that gets us a pretty decent life. That everyone gets such a life means that we give up the chance of an absolutely fabulous life, but we also protect ourselves from a really terrible one, a life in which we are in the thick of a cutthroat competition, vulnerable to the attacks of everyone around us. That is a deal worth making. Here's why. The prisoner's dilemma. Consider life's basic scenario. There is intense competition for scarce resources. We each want as much of those resources as we can get. Being rational, we each try to get as much as we can, knowing that more for us means less for someone else. Things are going to get very bad very quickly. This is what happens to the thousands of fishermen who sought ever larger catches, resulting in the emptying of the Chesapeake Bay, for centuries one of the world's greatest fisheries. This is what happened when baseball players, Tour de France cyclists, and Olympic weightlifters began to take increasingly dangerous anabolic steroids in a bid to gain a competitive edge and lucrative championships. This is what happens when a politician starts a smear campaign and his opponent feels the need to ramp up the abuse in order to stand a fighting chance in the race. This is what always happens in turf battles over the spoils of an illegal drug trade. These cases all share the same essential features. In each, there is mounting competition over a scarce resource, and many are trying their best to increase their share of it. That seems to be rational, and yet if everyone stopped being so selfish, each person would be better off. There would still be fish in the Chesapeake Bay, sustaining the communities surrounding it. Athletes would be safer, even if the world records in their fields were a bit less spectacular. These sorts of situations, in which everyone would be better off by scaling back their pursuit of self-interest, are known as prisoners' dilemmas. The name comes from a scenario introduced by economists in which two thieves, call them Al and Bob, are caught and sent to separate detention cells. Being rational, Al and Bob previously made a deal with each other. If they get caught, they'll each keep silent to thwart the police and protect themselves. Now that they have been captured, the police tell each one the same thing. If you keep your promise to your partner by keeping quiet and he rats on you, then he's off the hook and you're looking at a 6-year sentence. If you break your word and snitch on him while he remains silent, you're home free while he spends the next 6 years in jail. If you both keep quiet, you'll each get 2 years. But if you both confess, you'll each get 4. Suppose that both criminals know about the various outcomes and that they both have only one concern at this point, to minimize their jail time. If they are both rational, what are they going to do? You might think that it's impossible to know the answer, since you don't know enough about Al or Bob, their bond with each other, their trustworthiness, and so on, to make an informed guess. But really, there is no doubt that each is going to confess. They are going to break their promise to each other, landing themselves a 4-year sentence apiece. That's a far cry from getting off scot-free, and double the 2 years they'd get if they each kept quiet. The important point is that remaining silent is the cooperative strategy. Silence here means keeping one's word, honoring the terms of the deal. Confession is a betrayal, breaking one's promise, abandoning a partner. Al and Bob are going to betray each other, that's certain. They'll do this because they know the odds, because they are self-interested, and because they are rational. Why will they confess? Because no matter what his accomplice does, each criminal will be better off by confessing. Consider Al's choices. Suppose that Bob remains silent. Then if Al confesses, Al is home free. If Al keeps his mouth shut, Al gets 2 years. So if Bob remains silent, Al should confess. That will minimize his jail time. That is what he most wants. So if Al is rational, he will confess. Now suppose that Bob confesses. Then if Al confesses, Al gets 4 years in jail. Silence gets him 6. So if Bob confesses, Al should confess too. Thus, either way, Al does best for himself by spilling the beans and breaking his promise to Bob. And of course, Bob is reasoning in the same way. They are both going to confess and end up with 4 years in jail. The prisoner's dilemma isn't just some interesting thought experiment. It's real life. There are countless cases in which the rational pursuit of self-interest will lead people to refuse to cooperate with one another, even though this leaves everyone much worse off. The Chesapeake fishermen were in a prisoner's dilemma with one another. So are world-class athletes once they discover that some of their competitors are taking performance-enhancing drugs. So are gang members who are gunning for their competition. A cooperative strategy would have saved them their livelihoods or their lives. Cooperation and the state of nature. So why don't competitors cooperate? The answer is simple: because it is so risky. The criminals in the prisoner's dilemma could cooperate, but that would mean taking a chance at a 6-year sentence and betting everything on your partner's good faith. Unilaterally keeping silent, reducing your catch, refusing the use of steroids, forsaking violence, these are strategies for suckers. Those who adopt them may be virtuous, but they are the ones who will be left behind, rotting in jail, economically struggling, off the Olympic podium, or the victim of an enemy's gunshot. If enough people are willing to do what it takes to ensure that they get ahead, then you've either got to join in the competition or be the sacrificial lamb. Englishman Thomas Hobbes, born 1588, died 1679, the founder of modern contractarianism, was especially concerned with one sort of prisoner's dilemma. He invited the readers of his magnum opus Leviathan to imagine a situation in which there was no government, no central authority, no group with the exclusive power to enforce its will on others. He called this situation the state of nature, and he thought it was the worst place you could ever be. In his words, the state of nature is a war of all against all, in which the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People ruthlessly compete with one another for whatever goods are available. Cooperation is a sham, and trust is non-existent. Hobbes himself lived through a state of nature, the English Civil War, and thus had first-hand knowledge of its miseries. If you've ever read The Lord of the Flies, you have an idea of what Hobbes is talking about. As I write this, I can turn on my television and see pictures of states of nature from around the world, in parts of Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan. The scenes are terrible. The Hobbesian state of nature is a prisoner's dilemma. By seeking to maximize self-interest, everyone is going to be worse off. In such dire circumstances, everyone is competing to gain as much as he can at the expense of others. With so much at stake, an all-out competition is bound to be terrible for almost everyone. No one is so smart or strong or well-connected as to be free from danger. There is an escape from the state of nature, and the exit strategy is the same for all prisoners' dilemmas. We need two things: beneficial rules that require cooperation and punish betrayal, and an enforcer who ensures that these rules are obeyed. The rules are the terms of the social contract. They require us to give up the freedom to attack and to kill others, to cheat them and lie to them, to beat and threaten them and take from them whatever we can. In exchange for giving up these freedoms, and others, we gain the many advantages of cooperation. It is rational to give up some of your freedom, provided that you stand a good chance of getting something even better in return. The peace and stability of a well-ordered society is worth it. That is the promise of the social contract. But you need more than good rules of cooperation to escape from a prisoner's dilemma. You also need a way to make sure the rules are kept. The state of nature comes to an end when people agree with one another to give up their unlimited freedoms and to cooperate on terms that are beneficial to all. The problems with agreements, though, is that they can be broken, and without a strong incentive to keep their promises, people in prisoners' dilemmas are going to break them. Just think of Al and Bob in our original example. What's needed is a powerful person, or group, whose threats give everyone excellent reason to keep their word. The central power doesn't have to be a government. It could be a mob boss who threatens Al and Bob with death if they were to break their silence. It could be the International Olympic Committee, with the power to suspend or disqualify athletes who test positive for illegal substances. But in the most general case, in which we are faced with anarchy and are trying to escape from utter lawlessness, what we need is a government to enforce basic rules of cooperation. Without a central government, the situation will spiral downhill into a battleground of competing factions and individuals, warlords and gang bosses, each vying for as much power and wealth as possible. A war of all against all won't be far behind. The advantages of contractarianism. Contractarianism has many advantages. Here are some of the most important ones. Morality is essentially a social phenomenon. For anyone all alone on a desert island or on a remote mountain retreat, there is no possibility of moral or immoral action. That is because moral rules are nothing other than special rules of cooperation, and when it comes to cooperation, it takes at least two to tango. This explains why we have no self-regarding moral duties, duties that apply only to oneself. True, we can fail ourselves in a number of ways. We can become strung out addicts and ruin our potential. We can make poor financial decisions that leave us bankrupt. We can make an awful career choice and spend our days in drudgery. In all of these cases, we are highly imprudent. But when such actions have no bearing on others, they often do, of course, then contractarians will deny that there is anything immoral about them. Contractarianism explains and justifies the content of the basic moral rules. On the contractarian account, the moral rules are ones that are meant to govern social cooperation. When trying to figure out which standards are genuinely moral ones, contractarians ask us to imagine a group of free, equal, and rational people who are seeking terms of cooperation that each could reasonably accept. The rules they select to govern their lives together are the moral rules. These will closely match the central moral rules we have long taken for granted. John Rawls, born 1921, died 2002, the most famous 20th century social contract theorist, had a specific test for determining the rules that the ideal social contractors would support. In his Theory of Justice, 1971, by most accounts the most important work of political philosophy written in the last century, Rawls has us envision contractors behind a veil of ignorance. This is an imaginary device that erases all knowledge of your distinctive traits. Those behind the veil know that they have certain basic human needs and wants, but they know nothing of their religious identity, their ethnicity, their social or economic status, their sex, or their moral character. The idea is to put everyone on an equal footing so that the choices they make are completely fair. When placed behind a veil of ignorance or in some other condition of equality and freedom, what social rules will rational people select? These will almost certainly include prohibitions of killing, rape, battery, theft, and fraud, and rules that require keeping one's word, returning what one owes, and being respectful of others. Contractarianism thus easily accounts for why the central moral rules are what they are. Rational, self-interested people, free of coercion, would agree to obey them, so long as others are willing to obey them too. The rules of cooperation must be designed to benefit everyone, not just a few. Otherwise, only a few would rationally endorse them, while the rest would rationally ignore them. This allows the contractarian to explain why slavery and racial and sexual discrimination are so deeply immoral. Biased policies undermine the primary point of morality, to create fair terms of cooperation that could earn the backing of everyone. Even if oppressed people identify with the interests of their oppressors and staunchly defend the system of discrimination, that does not make it right. The correct moral rules are those that free people would endorse for their mutual benefit, not for the benefit of one group over another. Contractarianism offers a method for justifying every moral rule. Contractarianism is a prime example of proceduralism. Contractarians have a method for seeing whether certain actions are right or wrong. They invite us to think about whether free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by rules that allow the action in question. Contractarians do not assume that the standard moral evils are bad. Rather, they show why they are bad by showing that rational contractors getting together to select mutually beneficial rules of cooperation would forbid such behavior. Thus, we are never at the point where we have to say to people, "Don't you just see that blank is wrong?" Contractarians never have to make this move, which is excellent since it can't possibly convince someone who doesn't already agree with you. Rather, contractarians offer a method for justifying every single moral rule. Of course, disagreements will arise when we apply this method. There is plenty of room for argument about what free, equal, and rational people would accept. Still, if contractarianism is correct, then we will always have something to say when it comes to justifying even the most fundamental moral claims. Contractarianism explains the objectivity of morality. Contractarianism offers an attractive picture of the status of morality. Moral rules, on this view, are objective. Anyone can be mistaken about what morality requires. Personal opinion isn't the final authority in ethics. Neither is the law or conventional wisdom. Whole societies can be mistaken about what is right and wrong because they may be mistaken about what free, equal, and rational people would include in their ideal social code. Thus, contractarians have an answer to a perennial challenge. If morality isn't a human creation, where did it come from? If contractarianism is correct, morality does not come from God, nor does it come from human opinion. Rather, morality is the set of rules that would be agreed to by people who are very like us, only more rational and wholly free, and who are selecting terms of cooperation that will benefit each and every one of them. Thus, contractarians don't have to picture moral rules as eternally true, and they can deny that moral rules are just like the rules of logic or of natural science, other areas where we acknowledge the existence of objective truths. The moral rules are the outcomes of rational choice, tailored to the specifics of human nature and the typical situations that humans find themselves in. This removes the mystery of objective morality. Even if God doesn't exist, there can still be objective values, so long as there are mutually beneficial rules that people would agree to if they were positioned as equals, fully rational and free. Contractarianism explains why it is sometimes acceptable to break the moral rules. Moral rules are designed for cooperative living, but when cooperation collapses, the entire point of morality disappears. When things become so bad that the state of nature approaches or has been reached, then the ordinary moral rules lose their force. One way to put this idea is to say that every moral rule has a built-in escape clause. Do not kill, cheat, intimidate, and so on, so long as others are obeying this rule as well. When those around you are saying one thing and doing another and cannot be counted on to limit the pursuit of their self-interest, then you are freed of your ordinary moral obligations to them. The basis of morality is cooperation, and that requires trust. When that trust is gone, you are effectively in a state of nature. The moral rules don't apply there, because the basic requirement of moral life, that each person be willing to cooperate on fair terms that benefit everyone, is not met. This explains why you aren't bound to keep promises made at gunpoint, or to be the only taxpayer in a land of tax cheats. It explains why you don't have to wait patiently in line while many others are cutting in, or to obey a curfew or a handgun law if everyone else is violating it. When you can't rely on others, there is no point in making the sacrifices that cooperative living requires. There is no moral duty to play the sucker. More advantages: morality and the law. Contractarianism justifies a basic moral duty to obey the law. The social contract theory also has plausible things to say about why we are sometimes morally allowed to break the law. Before explaining this, though, consider why such cases are the exceptions, why we are usually, on contractarian grounds, morally required to obey the law. The law enables us to escape from the state of nature, and so to gain all of the good things that come from a stable, peaceful society, and the benefits are real. We can securely purchase items online, safely walk the streets, trust the mail service, and rely on legal contracts that we've entered, only because most people involved in these activities honor the rules that benefit everyone. You have a role to play here. Your obedience to the law helps to support the institutions that make so many benefits possible. Those who break the law are undermining these highly beneficial institutions. They are also taking unfair advantage of the sacrifices made by their fellow citizens. That is immoral. Therefore, we all have a basic moral duty to obey the law. The contractarian justification of legal punishment. Those who break the law are rightly punished, and the social contract theory has a natural explanation of this. Its account nicely blends some of the most attractive aspects of consequentialism and Kantianism, while solving a couple of hard problems in the philosophy of law along the way. If punishment fails to deter crime, then the state cannot effectively serve its enforcer role, and so its ultimate justification is undercut. To achieve its aim of keeping the peace, the state's threats for lawbreaking have to be credible. To be credible, they must usually be carried out. And so, when people break the law, they need to be punished. That is the only way we can avoid falling into a state of nature. Social contract theorists can also offer a Kantian rationale for legal punishment. When laws are good, they set out terms of fair play. When criminals break these laws, they take unfair advantage of their fellow citizens. They get all of the benefits of membership without shouldering the burdens that make the benefits possible. We right such wrongs by removing the criminal's ill-gotten gains. Punishment can do that. It can restore a level playing field. It can eliminate a criminal's unjust enrichment. It corrects the balance of benefits and burdens in society, and thereby sends a message that everyone is equal before the law. Criminals have acted as if they could simply take what they wanted without making the needed sacrifices that the rest of us have made. In doing so, criminals have placed themselves outside the protection of the law. They cannot complain if they are punished as a result. Contractarianism justifies the state's role in criminal law. The contractarian justification of punishment neatly answers two related questions that have long perplexed philosophers. 1. Why should the state, as opposed to private citizens, be the one who brings criminal charges and administers punishments? And 2, why should we have a criminal law in the first place? Why not just have the civil laws, torts, contracts, etc., and allow those who have been wronged to bring lawsuits against those who have harmed them? The social contract theory has answers. The state's ultimate purpose is to aid our escape from the state of nature. This gives it special authority to determine who is posing a threat to social stability. The actions that are most dangerous to society, treason, assassination, hijacking, attacking government agencies, are prohibited by the criminal law. That makes perfect sense given the different purposes of the criminal and civil law. The function of the civil law is to repair personal harms and wrongs. The function of the criminal law is to preserve the state and all of the advantages it provides. That is why a state representative, say a district attorney or a federal prosecutor, rather than a private citizen, initiates criminal charges. And that is why criminal punishment is a state affair rather than a private matter to be settled between citizens. Contractarianism and civil disobedience. Contractarianism has attractive things to say about why we have a duty to obey the law, and why criminals are rightly punished for violating just laws. But what if the laws are unjust and fail to set out fair terms of cooperation? What if the ideal social code and a society's actual laws are miles apart? In that case, the social contract theorist can explain why breaking the law, under certain circumstances, can be morally acceptable. Laws are morally justified when they mirror the rules that free and equal people would accept. And so, when laws themselves are grossly unfair, or when fair laws are applied in a discriminatory way, the primary point of having a society under law is undermined. Those who always get the short end of the stick are being constantly asked to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others. That isn't right, and the social contract theory explains why. The point of morality is to guarantee mutual benefit from fair terms of cooperation. Discriminatory policies and practices only frustrate this goal. Governments must earn the allegiance of their citizens. They do this by making their citizens much better off than they would be in a state of nature. That is why it is rational for people to agree to be governed. But when whole classes of people are enslaved or discriminated against, then the government has lost its moral authority over them, and that seriously weakens the moral duty to obey the government's laws. Indeed, this means that it is sometimes appropriate to disobey the laws. The precise conditions are very difficult to state, but certain cases seem clear. Think, for instance, of the protests that Gandhi initiated against British colonial rule, those of Chinese Democrats at Tiananmen Square, or those led by Martin Luther King Jr. against segregationist laws in the American South. These cases of civil disobedience each involved illegal activities, but the laws being challenged were deeply immoral, and the illegal actions were morally powerful precisely because, 1. The protesters took the law into their own hands only as a last resort after all feasible negotiations had failed. 2. They acted openly, not secretly, and were willing to pay the price by going to jail and suffering the beatings of police. 3. They acted non-violently, often in the face of physical violence. And 4. They were clearly motivated not by the promise of personal gain, but rather by the hope of furthering the cause of justice. In just about every respect, these classic cases of civil disobedience are morally very different from the work of ordinary criminals. In acting as they did, the non-violent protesters were showing a respect for the rule of law. This sounds paradoxical, but their message was clear. They tried to change the law because it was deeply unfair. They didn't want to replace it with anarchy, but rather with a system of real legal justice. They recognized the great value of a society under law, under just law. When there is no choice but to remain oppressed, resort to violence, or opt for peaceful and open resistance to injustice, the social contract theory favors the latter course. Isn't that the most admirable choice?